Hi, Valeska. Nice to meet you. I'm Dale Southerton. I'm a Professor of Consumption Studies in the School of Management at the University of Bristol. And my research over the last 20 years has focused on, in broad terms, how societies change, particularly focusing on the way that people live their day-to-day lives, their patterns of consumption, and the resource intensity of those patterns of consumption. So I'm really interested in the way we live our lives, the way we organise things, from our kitchens, our laundry, the energy consumption embedded in those practices, how they escalate over a period of time, and how they get locked into our everyday practices. And lots of my work is focused on that. And tell me a bit about what you do.
So my name's Valeska Ting. I'm a professor of smart nanomaterials in mechanical engineering at Bristol. And my interest is in looking at materials for energy storage. So for applications like using hydrogen instead of fossil fuels for low carbon transportation, and looking at ways that we can store energy for later use, so that we can increase the use of sustainable resources like solar and wind power. But so it seems like we're coming from net zero from two quite different perspectives.
I mean, I was going to ask, what are nanomaterials? I mean, that sounds really.
So all it means is really small materials.
I know that bit.
Yeah.
But what are the really big things then in nanomaterials in terms of solutions or capabilities?
Well, the neat thing is that so the point about nanomaterials is that when you shrink something down to those sorts of nanometer or angstrom sizes, so we're talking about thousands of times smaller than the diameter of a human hair, then the properties of the materials really start to change. And so the stuff that I'm interested in, you're looking at materials that have nanoscale pores in them. So imagine a kitchen sponge, but shrunk down thousands of times. But because they've got these tiny pores, they, instead of sucking in water like a sponge would, they can suck in molecules like hydrogen. And so you get these materials, and they've got huge surface areas. So one teaspoon of these materials can have the same surface area as a football pitch. And so these materials can suck in huge amounts of hydrogen. And so you can carry around this gaseous fuel really safely in a small volume. And it's all because of these tiny pores. So we're developing materials with new pores so that they can store more hydrogen, and you can drive your cars further because.
Okay, I always find that the technical amazing. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling and so on. But so are you developing those kinds of nano hydrogen storage pores, or particularly with transport in mind?
Yeah, well, because I think it's one of the biggest problems at the moment. If you're looking at carbon dioxide emissions or any sort of emissions, so transport is a huge proportion of that. And also, if you're looking at just general air quality as well. So if we can take fossil fuels out of the equation, then suddenly we're looking at more sustainable transportation. You're not contributing to bad air quality or global warming to the same extent. But I suppose that you can develop a technology, but you can't just have that technology in isolation, right? It's part of a bigger system. But what do you think about because I guess this has been on people's minds because of the pandemic, right? And we haven't been flying, we haven't been driving.
Yeah.
So you think people's perspectives on what sort of transportation we need, or whether we need it at all, do you think that will change?
I think what the pandemic does is show very tangibly that the way we live our lives can change quite quickly and quite radically. So for my frustration is always that there is a tendency, particularly in some parts of policy, to think of human behaviour as essentially conservative and slow to change. And I don't think that's true. I think, it depends where you're looking, but human behaviour can change quite rapidly, and we've seen that with the pandemic, and that's because there's all sorts of constraints on our lives. But what will happen is anyone's guess. But we have, in a sense, turbocharged our capacity to have meetings like we're having now online. Only a few weeks before the lockdown last year, I'm on the University Sustainability Council, and we were talking about a policy for more online meetings so that staff could reduce their travel to work.
Right.
And it was seen just before lockdown, it was seen as too difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
With people who are not familiar with the technology, with the etiquette of how to speak to one another on an online meeting. And then out of necessity, we've learned all of those skills. It's, my parents who are old now do Zoom meetings with my kids and stuff all the time. So we've learned very quickly how to use those technologies. But one of the outcomes could be that you start to see the regeneration of local communities, local high streets, local businesses. I mean, you'll see some death of coffee shops in city centres, but you may well start to see more local activities, which is also quite good for net zero. If we're more engaged in our local communities, we feel more connected to our local communities, then that's also potentially positive for the way in which, from me, we go about our consumption. So less travelling into cities and more walking into your high street to do your consumption is another reduction of the energy use that's embedded in our day-to-day practices.
So I'm thinking now, because we're talking about two sides. Like, so one of them is, I guess, taking a view where you can do a behind the scenes swap of carbon intense fossil fuels for more sustainable or lower carbon fuels, and basically by doing that, people don't realize that they're using less carbon, and they don't have to change their behaviors. But then you can couple that with getting people to be conscious that if they turn the heating down or don't fly as much, then they're also contributing. It'll be interesting to find out what sort of ratio that's at. Sorry, that's an engineer in me. It's like which one contributes more.
I think it's a really important question, and I was going to, I'm interested to know how engineers think about some of these questions about behaviour change and so on, because you need the more resource efficient technologies. That's really, really important. But what we've seen over the last 30, 40 years is we have more efficiency per unit of consumption because of technological innovation, and more consumption, and the more consumption outstrips the efficiency. So the net effect to the environment is still getting worse. Surveys for a very long time have shown that the vast majority of people really, really care about the environment and really want to be pro-environmental, and actually do lots of what we might think of as relatively small tasks. So you think of recycling. The reduction of food waste in UK households is huge. It's massive. We've made some really big shifts. If you look at the way that supermarkets deliver food and their distribution, I mean, we've made some massive gains over the last 15, 20 years. But the problem is still there. So I think there is a real emphasis needed on governments to create the conditions in which you can both have the technological substitution effects that we talked about, use new technologies to create new ways of organising our day-to-day lives, and actually leading by creating new sets of constraints on people's behaviour.
So I'm thinking about, what you were saying about recycling and how people will have these interventions to try and lead a more sustainable life. But I guess just thinking, because one of the reasons I went into material science and research in the first place was because I was thinking, is this enough? Don't we have to change the whole of the way that we manufacture things? And I think the scale of the problem is something that's quite hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. Behaviour change on its own is nowhere near enough.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think it's an important piece of the puzzle, because so if I think about the interventions that we're working on in engineering, you're looking at things like using digital prototyping or VR to so that you can speed up the manufacturing process and use less material, and so there's less material waste. You make the manufacturing process faster, cheaper, better, more efficient, lower carbon. But if you're pumping out twice as many sets of sneakers, it's not really like low carbon or sustainable, right?
Yeah, exactly, completely. And I think, yeah, there was a period about 10 or 15 years ago in particular where there was a sort of strong narrative from policy, from governments and so on, that if only we could change people's behaviour, everything else will follow. And it's never going to be enough to just change people's behaviour. We need to invest in the technological innovation to do exactly the things that you're talking about. But we can't just go for technology fixes. We also have to do behaviour. So it'd be really nice to have more coordinated policy that thinks across these three dimensions of change, rather than, I mean, it seems to flip-flop one way or the other and place more emphasis on one set of solutions than any other. So some sort of coordinated vision of what futures might look like.
The solution, I guess, is complicated because you've got different energy sources and different solutions for different forms of transportation for different occasions. So like, for example, if you're just pottering around inner city Bristol, then a battery electric vehicle is perfectly fine. Like it's zero emissions as long as your electricity comes from, say, wind or solar. It's really efficient. But the difficulties there are when you start to go longer range. So if you want to drive from here to Aberdeen, then you're going to have to drive, stop when your battery is discharged, wait till it charges up, and that charge discharge time lag is something that consumers aren't used to. So that's when you use something like hydrogen, and the same for intercontinental flight. Like so if you wanted to do short haul flights, then you can use batteries. If you want to go from here to Australia, there's no way you could carry that weight of batteries. So that's why industry is looking at things like hydrogen, which is a really light but energy dense fuel in terms of weight. So so you're looking at different solutions for different applications.
So, but would that then mean you have a car that runs on electric battery when you're doing local trips, but when you want to drive to Aberdeen, it switches to hydrogen mode?
Yeah, you could have a hybrid system. Yeah. But I do think because I like your model where you have you might have two different vehicles. And as you say, if you want to drop your kids off at university 3 times a year, and if it's far away, then you just opt in for the hydrogen vehicle and use it over those long distances. And for the rest of the time, you use a battery electric vehicle around the city. And so because the thing is, if you have all vehicles with these dual power systems, like with the batteries plus the hydrogen, that's twice as much infrastructure that you have to manufacture and put in the car. And so if you can, again, looking at changing people's behaviors or their expectations so that they only use the vehicle that they need for that particular purpose.
Yeah, because the transition to, if those kinds of vehicles are really expensive, and the transition, we've got to build in the infrastructure and so on, is going to be very slow, and it's going to take 10, 15, 20 years, whereas if you switch the expectations around, not owning cars to that kind of model, it could happen quite quickly.
This is really interesting for me because like I'm trying to think of where we can target our effort in terms of making the biggest impact in reducing carbon. And I'm thinking, okay, all right, if we sort out the issue with swapping over the fuels in long haul flights, like from kerosene to hydrogen, then people can fly, and that's fine. And then we look at the behavior change on the day-to-day.
One of the great things about being at Bristol and the Cabot Institute and so on is it does create a space and an opportunity for the conversation. These are reasonably typical conversations that colleagues have who are members of the Cabot Institute. I think that's really, really important because you can then start to think about how behaviour change, different ways of organising life, and the technological innovations that are available, how you can bring them together to create sort of whole system solutions. I think that's really, really important.
I suppose the interactions I've had have always been on the technological side, like so getting through to politicians, but because take the the argument of battery electric vehicles or so how we were talking about infrastructure. You need the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure, to enable people to use the cars when they buy them. They won't put the infrastructure in until enough people have bought cars, and people won't buy cars until you've got the infrastructure. It's really chicken and egg. And so you need policymakers to make a commitment to prompt that behavioral change. Yeah. And so I guess we've always been discussing this idea that you need lots of different technologies for different applications. It's really got to be a mix of different solutions. And so I've always approached it from a technology angle, but now I'm wondering, like, is there something that we can do to, like, as scientists, as engineers, to influence the way that policymakers think?
I know that Bristol has got the One City plan, which Cabot Institute and many of our colleagues have been heavily involved in, and this is for the Bristol city, and that does try to offer a mechanism for coordinating mixed solutions to some of the major problems that the city faces. And that's I'd describe it as an experiment because it's quite new, but it'd be really interesting to see what happens, because Bristol's already pretty much at the forefront, I think, of finding environmental solutions and equitable solutions to the issues that the city faces. So it'd be quite interesting to see how that goes.
Well, like I guess you're thinking the same as me. Like like these sorts of experiments, because the problems are so complex and all of the solutions are so interwoven, that leads to that uncertainty and the uncertainty paralysis for government investment. So if you can demonstrate that on a smaller scale and say, yes, this will work as long as we consider these I guess the intersection of different solutions, or consider this issue that we didn't know would arise, like that, taking that sort of uncertainty out and being able to model that complex system and then extrapolate out to what it would be like on a national level.
I mean, the Cabot Institute is fantastic for bringing together people, but we all know we're all constrained by our day jobs in a sense with all the work, and so it would be really good if the UK government invested some money in developing capacity for more interaction between different disciplinary expertise. So, because it's very much focused on particular projects or particular research grants at the moment, but just more space for these kinds of conversations so that social scientists can understand better where engineers are coming from, what engineers are talking about, and vice versa, and not just social science and engineering, which is, and actually engineering is a big catch-all category for a whole range of disciplines and subfields, as is social science. So there could be much more done, I think, around having a sort of national interdisciplinary centre of excellence on environmental solutions or something like that. I mean, Cabot does that for the University of Bristol, but policymakers, give us loads more money so we can solve the problems.
Yeah. Well, I do think like in terms of Cabot, like it is a really nice example of I guess drawing on the expertise in Bristol, because we're really lucky. We've got this broad interdisciplinary base of fundamental research and science, and people are doing so many different things and looking at problems from so many different viewpoints, and then being able to bring that together and to use other people as a sounding board as well.
These kinds of safe, neutral spaces that are created, and there's a lot of work goes into doing that. I mean, I think that's really, really important when it comes to finding these kind of mixed solutions, bringing the evidence to bear to help inform policymakers, and for us to be able to, as academics, as scholars, be able to talk more consistently and coherently when engaging with policymakers and businesses and strategies. I think that's really, really important, and there's not enough investment in the UK research infrastructure to enable those kinds of safe spaces to happen. And that's one of my concerns about the whole net zero thing, is that it seems more of a target than a strategy. And it's a fine target. Nothing wrong with it as a target, but what's the strategy for achieving it that involves developing understanding and connections and collaborations, and creating opportunities for different groups to find solutions. So lots of it's top down at the moment. Lots of it's kind of big energy infrastructure technologies, but there's lots of scope for there was the transitions movement in the UK over the last 15 years, which is just an encouragement of innovation, technological and social innovation in local towns. And you could become a transition town, and you had local wind power generated energy, because members of communities got together and developed them. Those sorts of things are as important, I think, as some of the major big investments in offshore wind power, which are also really, really important, even though they operate at different scales in terms of the impact. Is in terms of moving us in a direction towards what could be seen as net zero. Those are really important parts of a strategy. So I do worry that sometimes net zero is only thought about or is dominated as a target rather than as a strategy for developing the way that our societies are going to change, because they will change whatever we do.
Yeah, well, I think, and one thing I haven't got clear in my mind yet is so if you've got all of these say these businesses or these sectors or these even regions and invested in this idea of net zero, we're all interconnected globally, right? And so where does your boundary of your zero emissions sit, and are you just displacing the problem somewhere else along the supply chain?
It's a massive problem, and do you count those emissions based on consumption activities or production activities? So we'll get, if we measure our emissions in terms of our productive output, we'll get to net zero a lot quicker than if we measure it by our consumption. But much of the emissions for my consumption and your consumption is counted in China, where the books are made that we buy.
So it really has to be. It's going back to this coordination idea that you had. That like this thinking of that policymakers have to collaborate across governments. Yeah, we all have to be moving in the same direction.
There's not a singular answer or a singular way of measuring or counting for net zero, and I think many of our colleagues would be very nervous about focusing so explicitly on net zero, because there are many other issues out there, like ecological emergencies, impacts on our oceans and so on, that are as problematic as simply the question of net zero, of carbon.
Yeah, that's right. And then thinking about the impacts on different parts of society and different parts of the world as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, is getting to net zero at the expense of people's livelihoods or lifestyles. But I'm guessing that if we can consider these things like as a whole system or holistically from the beginning, hopefully we'll head off a lot of these problems.
That's why I think it's so important that we open up the different forms of dialogue and conversation, both in terms of interdisciplinarity, and have the safe spaces to have those kinds of conversations, which I'm not sure we always do, particularly not in sort of policy type circles where there's such a rush to get to the answer. How can we transition the whole sets of systems in directions that will make us more sustainable and more equitable? And what would that future look like? That's the conversation that needs to be had, I think. And we don't have that conversation. We don't have, that I'm aware of, conversations about what will life look like in 2030 in the UK. Will it be more travel, less travel? Will it be hydrogen, electric? Will it be people owning cars or not owning cars? We don't have that conversation. And the idea that these things, we can't have those conversations because these things will just happen because markets follow patterns of demand and supply and demand, I think is not true. I think, we do have some capacity to direct our future, direct ourselves in terms of the types of future we want, and therefore what the future should be part of a public debate. So the climate assemblies were good for that purpose. So I liked the climate assembly approach. Colleagues from Bristol were involved in that, which was really, really good. I think Bristol had probably a very high representation of the people involved in Bristol University in terms of experts and so on. But I think that's a really good way of opening up and bringing in different voices to have a conversation about, okay, here's the challenges. What sorts of future society do we want? Not you or I want, or we'd probably have similar views, but different groups based on age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, so on. All of these voices need to be included in these conversations, I think, but very much with where do we want to get to, not just let's have a chat about all the problems in the world. So if you had one message for policymakers, what would it be?
So my message would probably be that there's not one single solution. So we have to investigate a range of diverse solutions for different applications, and those solutions all need investment. What would you tell them?
Mine's sort of twofold. One is, in a sense, to stop reinventing the wheel. So I think that I've been working in this field for sort of 20 years, and we have trends and things come and go. And at one point it's behaviour change, then it's really focused on technology fixes, and then you go back to behaviour change. And the lessons learned from the last round of behaviour change initiatives seem to have been lost. And that's partly to do with the change of people in government or in policy. So there needs to be, we need to build on existing knowledge, not continually reinvent and go back to existing knowledge. And I think we need to be much more open to debates about what sort of future society can we have. Not do we want, but can we have, including the technological capabilities and options, including the way we might organise our day-to-day lives and so on. So I think we should have that as a public debate.